Welcome to this episode of Professor Messer's free CompTIA A+ certification training course. I'm your host, James Messer, and in this particular module, we're going to talk about CPU, Central Processing Units. This comes from the exam objectives in 220-601, Section 1.1, where we're going to understand more about the purposes and the characteristics of processors and CPUs. And we'll not only learn about the construction of processors, but we're also going to learn about how they work and how they're made up with their data bus, the address bus, learn about registers internal to the processors, and we'll learn about cache memory and math coprocessors as well. There's another few topics that we'll talk about as we go through this. CPUs themselves, though, are thought of as being the brain of your computer, that central processing unit. It is the part of the computer that handles a majority of the detailed processing inside the system. And it works like clockwork. In many ways, it works exactly like clockwork. We'll learn more about that in a moment. But this is an extremely complex clock. It is full of very, very tiny little pieces, and we're going to step through what all of those little pieces do in this video module and one that's following it, and learn more about the inside of a central processing unit and how we can take advantage of some of those capabilities and what we should look for. There's a lot of different kinds of processors, and you'll find in a single personal computer there's a number of actual processors that are inside the system, but really one is the central processing unit. And so as we go through these video modules, keep in mind that when we talk about this processor, the CPU, we're really talking about that one centralized processor inside the system. Now, the CPU cache that's inside a processor, you'll hear this term cache many times, and it's used in many different ways. In this video module, when we're dealing specifically with CPUs, we're talking about cache memory, how it's associated with that central processing unit. This is very fast memory. In fact, it's very, very fast memory in the way that it works. And there are different levels of cache. You'll find that as we look at a processor and how it works, that these different levels allow that processor to work very quickly. So when we talk about cache memory with a CPU, we're not talking about one level of cache, we're talking about many different layers. We'll talk about how that works in a moment. You'll hear this term, level 1 cache. It's often referred to as L1 cache. It's often on the processor itself, and although if you ever look at a processor, it's just a square block, or it's a different size block, but it doesn't look like there's a lot of different parts in there. In fact, there's many different pieces in there, and this level 1 cache memory is usually right there on the chip. And it's often on a per core basis as well. We'll talk about multiple cores in a CPU, but just keep in mind that if there is a processing unit, there is almost always these days an L1 cache associated with it. Now there's also L2 cache associated with it, and this is usually on a per CPU basis. In the early days of caching technology with processors, L2 cache was often on the motherboard itself. These days, the L2 cache is on the CPU. You'll find it there. If there is a cache on the motherboard, that's often referred to as L3 cache these days. Now, all of these cache technology terms are relatively generic. The level 1, level 2, and level 3 cache could be in different places than what I have here, but generally speaking, this is where we often find a cache when we're referring to a CPU and where it's located. This is a good descriptor of a CPU architecture. It's a very basic block diagram. In reality, a CPU architecture is much more complex than what we're looking at on our screen, but this helps us understand what the basic parts are, at least what we'll need to know for the A+ certification exam. Now, the first blocks on the left side are two that we were just talking about, this cache. The reason we have a cache on the CPU itself is because it allows us to greatly speed up the processing times. What will happen is when an ALU, an arithmetic logic unit, or a floating point unit needs to gather information, it usually goes out to memory that's on the system board, and that's outside the L2 cache. Once we receive that memory, that information from memory, the caches store a copy of that information. And if those ALUs or FPUs ever need to do any more calculations on that information, it doesn't have to go all the way out to what is a relatively slower memory on the system board. It just gathers it directly from the chip in this cache. That's extremely fast and it's extremely efficient. Allows these processors that we use today to work very, very quickly without having to wait while we're receiving information from memory, can act on it extremely quickly. The ALU is performing functions and performing calculations, and the FPU works along with it. If you're accustomed to some of the older type systems back in the 286, 386 days, you may recall something called a math coprocessor. This was a separate processor that you would purchase and you would install onto your motherboard. These days, the ability to do calculations with floating points is already integrated into the CPU itself. You don't have to purchase a separate math coprocessor any longer. On the far right part of the screen are registers, and registers are simply a place where we can temporarily store information so that the ALU and the FPU can perform calculations of those. So it's a place to take the memory, the information from memory, put it in a place, put a couple of different kinds of locations here, and perform calculations on those. And in reality, there's many, many more registers than the 4 that I've listed here, but if you ever look at a processor and the way that it works, these are 4 very common registers you'll find: an AX, a BX, a CX, and a DX. And so this process takes place of bringing the memory in, putting it into a register, performing calculations on that register, and sending it out again. And that's taking place over and over and over again inside of a central processing unit. If we expand this concept out into a wider view, a type of CPU you'll often see is something called a dual-core CPU. What this means is that this process of having these logic units performing calculations, here's one up here, and there's another exact duplicate on the bottom. You can see it there. And as we look at the architecture, those are two cores that are processing information at exactly the same time. It's almost like having 2 processors in a single system. What's interesting about that, and the reason that I put it on a separate